My uncle burned Grandpa's would steal everything, but Grandpa's secret plan made me rich. The day I lost, everything smelled like motor oil, hay, and betrayal. I'm Thomas Kelly, 38, just your average auto mechanic from Cedar Hollow, Iowa. Nothing special about me except maybe how easily I trusted family. Big mistake. I stood in my grandfather John's barn watching my inheritance go up in flames. The old place was like stepping into a time capsule. Tools he collected since the 50s hanging on the walls, that ancient radio still covered in grease fingerprints, and his pride and joy, a 1943 Dodge pickup truck sitting in the corner under a thin layer of dust. My Uncle Ray, Grandpa's only living son, had gathered with his boys Mitch and Dale around a rusty barrel, where they were having themselves a little bonfire. What were they burning? Oh, just Grandpa's notarized will, the one that left the farm to me. Ray's eyes couldn't meet mine as he tossed the document into flames. His belly pushed against his shirt buttons like they were fighting a losing battle. A midsection that looked like a sack of regret, as Grandpa would have said. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the desperation more than malice. "It's all mine now, Tommy. Without this paper, you're nobody," he mumbled, his voice lacking the conviction of a man who believed what he was doing was right. Mitch, his oldest son, didn't have that problem. His smirk said everything his daddy couldn't. "Don't get any ideas. Book boy, this place was never meant for someone who can't tell the difference between farming and reading about it." I stood there, frozen, not the Hollywood hero type who'd lunge for the burning paper or throw a punch. That's not me. Never has been. I'm the guy who reads history books about Iowa on lunch breaks and avoids confrontation like it's a communicable disease. The barn's familiar smell suddenly felt suffocating. Ray had been drowning in debt for years after his farm credit business went belly up faster than a catfish in August. Grandpa's 20 acres and farmhouse were his last lifeline, and he wasn't about to let his brother's kid get in the way, blood or not. "You know this isn't right." I finally managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Ray's shoulders hunched forward. "Life isn't right, Tommy. Sometimes you gotta make your own right." The irony wasn't lost on me. 12 years I spent caring for Grandpa through his heart disease, listening to his war stories, while Ray visited maybe twice a year with excuses thicker than Iowa humidity. I was the one who learned how he liked his coffee, black with just a hint of sugar that he'd never admit to. I was the one who drove him to doctor appointments when his hands shook too bad to hold the steering wheel. But none of that mattered now. My parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and Grandpa took me in when no one else would. But Iowa law doesn't care about who did the caregiving. Without a will, everything goes to the next of kin. Ray, Grandpa's only surviving child. I wanted to scream that there had to be an original copy with the notary. But Ray had mentioned last week that Grandpa's lawyer, old Mr. Peterson, had suddenly retired and closed his practice due to his own health problems. With the small-town office shuttered and records in transit to some firm in Des Moines, Ray was betting on confusion and delay. He'd always known people at the county clerk's office too. Connections I didn't have. Without immediate proof and with Ray's influence, what good would accusations do except make me look desperate? The smell of burning paper mixed with the lingering scent of Grandpa's pipe tobacco that still clung to the barn walls. For a second, I could almost hear Johnny Cash playing on that old record player Grandpa would crank up on summer evenings while we worked on the Dodge. "The man in black will be disappointed in you, Ray," I said quietly. Ray flinched. Grandpa and him used a bond over those records before Ray decided making money was more important than family visits. Dale, Ray's younger son, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Shifting his weight from one foot to another like the barn floor had suddenly turned to hot coals. He wasn't cut from the same cloth as his brother, but family loyalty runs deep in these parts. I stuffed my hands in my pockets to hide the trembling. "Good move, Uncle, but fire doesn't write documents either." Mitch stepped toward me, all puffed up like a rooster. "You saying something, Tommy boy?" I backed up a step. "Another thing, I'm not a fighter. Never saw the point in solving problems with fists when words work just fine. Problem is, sometimes words fail you too." Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. "Honesty is your compass, Tommy. Without it, You'll get lost every time. I was holding on to that compass for dear life right now, even as everything seemed hopeless. The flames were dying down, orange embers floating up like fireflies against the darkening sky to the open barn door. The will was nothing but ash now, along with any claim I thought I had to the place I called home for most of my life. Ray nodded to his sons. Let's go. Nothing more to do here. The three of them moved toward the door, boots crunching on the dirt floor. Mitch bumped my shoulder hard as he passed. Don't get any ideas about fighting this, Tommy. You can't afford the lawyers we can. The funny thing is, he was right. My mechanic's salary paid the bills, and not much else. Fighting Ray would mean emptying my savings, and probably losing anyway. As they left, I stayed in the barn, the silence almost deafening after they were gone. The smell of smoke hung in the air, acrid and bitter, like the taste in my mouth. I walked over to the old Dodge pickup, running my hand along its faded blue paint. This truck, at least, was mine. Grandpa had signed it over to me 3 years ago with proper paperwork. Ray couldn't touch it. The truck had been with Grandpa since forever. I remembered him teaching me to drive in it when I was 15, his calloused hands gripping the dashboard when I hit the gas too hard. Easy does it, Tommy. This ain't a race car, and you ain't Mario Andretti. We'd spent countless hours under its hood, him teaching me how engines work, how to respect machinery, how to fix things instead of replacing them. Life lessons disguised as auto repair. I climbed into the driver's seat, the old leather creaking beneath my weight. The keys were still in the ignition where Grandpa always left them. Who's going to steal a truck that only starts half the time? He'd joke. The dashboard still had a serve in 45 sticker and that little plastic hula girl he'd picked up on his one and only vacation to California in the 70s. Her skirt was faded, but she still swayed with the slightest movement. You wouldn't have given up, would you, Grandpa? I whispered, running my fingers over the worn steering wheel. I turned the key, and after a couple of tries, the engine roared to life like an old lion waking from a nap, still powerful but with a hint of age in its growl. The headlights cut through the growing darkness as I backed the Dodge out of the barn. I wasn't leaving empty-handed after all. This truck was my connection to Grandpa, to the man who taught me that your word was your bond, and that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always right. As I drove down the long gravel driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the farmhouse silhouetted against the evening sky. The place where I'd grown up, learned to be a man, nursed Grandpa through his final days. The home that should have been mine, but was now lost to Ray's desperation and greed. But Grandpa had another saying, too. The game ain't over till the last inning, Tommy. Maybe this was just a 7th-inning stretch in a 9-inning game. I pulled onto the main road, the truck's headlights illuminating the way home, or at least the small house with a detached garage I inherited from my parents on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was paid for. Still, for the past 12 years, I'd spent most of my time at Grandpa's place, coming home just to check mail and grab fresh clothes while I took care of him. My own house had become more like a storage unit than a home. Tomorrow I'd have to face reality, figure out what to do next, where to go from here. But tonight, I'd park this old Dodge in my garage and remember the man who believed in me when no one else did. The man who taught me that even when life knocks you down, you get back up, dust yourself off, and keep going. The truck rumbled beneath me, solid and dependable, just like the man who'd owned it. And somehow, sitting in this driver's seat felt like Grandpa was still with me, guiding me home one last time. It was nearly midnight when I pulled into my garage. The Dodge's engine ticked as it cooled down, like an old clock counting moment of a life that suddenly felt upside down. I sat there for a while, hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process everything that had happened. My house felt empty and neglected. Dust covered most surfaces. Mail piled up on the kitchen counter. For the past 12 years, this place had been little more than a pit stop between shifts at the garage and caring for Grandpa. Now it was all I had left. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, one of the few things I kept consistently stocked, and headed back out to the garage. Couldn't face those quiet rooms just yet. The Dodge sat there, its faded blue paint barely visible in the dim overhead light. Just you and me now, Old girl, I muttered, running my hand along the hood. This truck had been more than transportation to Grandpa. It was his history, his pride, his connection to a time when he felt most alive. He'd bought it after coming home from the war. One of the first things he purchased with his own money. Said it made him feel like a real American to drive a vehicle built in the country he'd fought for. I popped the hood and tinkered aimlessly with the engine, not fixing anything, just letting my hands remember the familiar paths Grandpa had taught me. The distributor cap he'd shown me how to clean when I was 10. The carburetor we rebuilt together on my 16th birthday, instead of throwing a party. Parties last a day, Tommy. Skills last a lifetime, he'd said, handing me a wrench like it was some sacred object being passed down through generations. Sleep wasn't coming anytime soon, so I decided to clean the interior. Grandpa kept the engine immaculate, but the cab had become a collection of memories over the years. Receipts from road trips, old maps folded and refolded until the creases turned to tears, a rabbit's foot keychain his father had given him for luck. I started with the driver's seat, carefully removing each item and placing it in a cardboard box. Even the trash felt important somehow. Pieces of Grandpa's life I wasn't ready to throw away yet. Moving to the passenger side, I noticed something odd about the seat. The upholstery had a small tear near the bottom edge, but it wasn't a normal wear tear. It looked deliberate, the stitching carefully cut rather than worn through. My heart rate picked up. Grandpa wasn't the type to leave his beloved truck damaged, even in a small way. If he hadn't fixed it, there was a reason. I grabbed my pocket knife and carefully widened the opening, trying not to damage the seat more than necessary. My fingers probed the gap and touched something that definitely wasn't foam or springs. Something flat and smooth, wrapped in plastic. "What the hell, Grandpa?" I whispered, working my fingers deeper. I nearly sliced my hand pulling the package out. It was sealed in waterproof plastic, the kind serious fishermen use to protect their licenses and maps. My hands trembled as I cut it open. Inside was an envelope, and inside that, a document with an official seal and my grandfather's unmistakable signature at the bottom. Another copy of the will. "Tommy, you either just became Sherlock Holmes or the biggest clown in Iowa," I muttered to myself as I carefully unfolded the document. It was all there in black and white. The farm, the 20 acres, everything left to me, Thomas Kelly, his grandson, just like I'd told Ray it would be. Along with the will was a folded piece of Grandpa's personalized stationery, pale blue paper with his name printed at the top in that old-fashioned font he loved. My hands shook as I unfolded the note. "Tommy, I knew you'd check the Dodge. Always were thorough, just like I taught you. Ray's been asking about the farm too much lately. Don't trust him with this. The will is real and notarized. Keep this copy safe. There's more to our land than you know. Check the coordinates below. Hold on to the truth tightly, son." Below were latitude and longitude numbers, precisely written in Grandpa's steady handwriting. I read the note 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. Grandpa had known. He'd anticipated Ray's move and left me an ace in the hole. There was a P.S. at the bottom of the note. "Truth is like a crop, Tommy. You sow it, you reap it." I felt like the air in the garage had suddenly gotten thinner. Grandpa wasn't just leaving me his property. He was leaving me a mystery. I pulled out my phone and plugged the coordinates into Google Maps. They pointed to a location about 5 miles outside town, on the northwestern edge of Grandpa's property, a section I'd rarely visited, mostly in used pasture with a small grove of trees. What was out there that Grandpa thought was so important? Sleep forgotten, I grabbed a flashlight and was halfway to the truck before reason caught up with me. It was the middle of the night. Whatever was at those coordinates had been there for who knows how long. It could wait until morning. Plus, I needed advice from someone who knew the area better than I did. Gus Mason had been Grandpa's friend for over 50 years. Their farms bordered each other, and they'd spent countless evenings on Gus's porch solving the world's problems over glasses of bourbon that never seemed empty. I barely slept that night. The will and note secure in a fireproof box I bought after a garage fire scare 3 years back. By 6 a.m., I was in the Dodge again, headed toward Gus's place with a thermos of coffee and a mind full of questions. Gus was already up, of course. Farmers don't acknowledge the existence of sleep-ins. He was on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise like it was a show put on especially for him. "Tommy," he nodded as I climbed the steps. "Heard about John's will. Ray's been talking all over town about his big plans for the land. Word travels fast in Cedar Hollow. Gossip is our main export, right after corn. Ray doesn't know everything," I said, pulling the will from my jacket and handed to Gus. His weathered face registered surprise, then something like satisfaction as he read it. "John, you clever old fox," he muttered. "There's more," I said, showing him the coordinates. "Grandpa wanted me to check the spot. Mean anything to you?" Gus studied the numbers, his forehead creasing. "Northwest corner, near the old lightning-struck oak." He looked up at me, something sparking in his eyes. "Tommy, you picked a hell of a time to find this." He set his coffee down with deliberate care. 2 months ago, some geology folks from the state university were testing soil samples all around this county. They were real interested in that exact area. "Soil samples? For what?" "Neodymium," Gus said, pronouncing it carefully like he'd been practicing. "It's one of them rare earth elements, used in making magnets for electric car motors, wind turbines, all that green energy stuff." My blank look must have said it all. "It's worth a fortune, Tommy. And they found traces of it in fields just like your grandpa's. Nothing confirmed yet, but enough to get those tech companies sniffing around, offering quick cash for land rights." I felt like I'd been sucker punched. If there was neodymium on Grandpa's land, we're talking serious money if it pans out. Gus continued, reading my thoughts. "Millions, potentially." The world tilted a little. "Millions? For our modest Iowa farm? The same land Ray had just stolen from me? That's why Ray's so desperate," I said slowly. "He must have heard something." Gus nodded. "Wouldn't surprise me. His boy Mitch works part-time at the county records office. Those geology reports get filed there." My mind was racing faster than the Dodge ever could. This wasn't just about Grandpa's farm anymore. This was about potentially life-changing wealth, and Ray knew it. "What do I do now, Gus?" Gus handed the will back to me, his expression serious. "First, you need to get this to a lawyer, a good one. This is a legal, notarized document. It trumps intestate succession if you can prove it's legitimate." He took a sip of his coffee, thinking. "Sarah Miller opened a practice in town last year. Young but sharp as a tack. Went to law school in Chicago and came back to help folks here. Start with her." "And the coordinates?" "We'll check them out, but first things first. Secure your claim to the land, Tommy. All the neodymium in the world won't matter if Ray manages to take legal ownership." Gus squinted at me, a hint of a smile breaking through his concern. "Found buried treasure. And you look like you just lost your lunch money. Your grandpa would get a kick out of that." I carefully tucked the will back into my jacket. The morning sun was climbing higher, gilding the cornfields around us in gold. Grandpa's land, my land, might contain more than just memories and good soil. It might hold a future I'd never imagined. Grandpa gave me a chance to make things right, I said, feeling something stir inside me, something that had been dormant since I watched Ray throw that will into the flames. Determination. "Your grandpa was the smartest man I knew," Gus said, standing up and clapping me on the shoulder. "Doesn't surprise me one bit he outfoxed Ray from beyond the grave." I headed back to the Dodge, my mind already plotting the next steps. The law office wouldn't open until 9, but I could get breakfast at Maggie's Diner downtown. Sarah Miller ate there most mornings, according to local gossip, and running into her accidentally seemed better than showing up at her office unannounced. I patted my jacket pocket, feeling the outline of the will inside. My heart was pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. This document could change everything. If I could prove it was legitimate, if the neodymium deposits were real, if I could move faster than Ray. That was a lot of ifs. But for the first time since watching that will burn, I felt like I had a fighting chance. As I fired up the Dodge, its familiar rumble felt different somehow, like the truck itself was eager to help me reclaim what was rightfully mine. I patted the dashboard, Thanks for keeping a secret. Old girl. I pulled out of Gus's driveway, the truck's worn tires kicking up dust as I headed toward town, toward Sarah Miller, and toward whatever future Grandpa had tried to secure for me. The coordinates and their mystery would have to wait a little longer. Sometimes, as Grandpa would say, you have to plow one field before moving to the next. Maggie's diner was buzzing with the morning crowd when I walked in. The smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around me like an old friend, familiar and comforting when everything else in my life had gone sideways. I spotted Sarah Miller immediately, not hard in a town where most folks have known each other since kindergarten. I'd never formally met her, but everyone knew Sarah, the hometown girl who'd gone off to law school in Chicago and come back to hang her shingle in Cedar Hollow instead of chasing big city money. Her parents still ran the hardware store downtown, and her brother coached the high school baseball team. She was Cedar Hollow royalty, in a modest Midwestern way. I recognized her from the town's 4th of July picnic last summer. She'd won the pie-eating contest, beating Sheriff Daniels by a slice and a half, then donated her prize to the Veterans Fund. That kind of thing sticks in people's memories around here. She sat alone at the counter, newspaper spread out beside her plate. Dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. I took a deep breath, ordered coffee from Maggie, and casually slid onto the stool next to hers. "You're John Kelly's grandson," she said without looking up from her paper. "Not a question. Small towns. No such thing as strangers." "Tommy Kelly." I nodded, try not to seem surprised. "And you're Sarah Miller." "The very same," she replied, finally glancing my way. "Sorry about your grandfather. He was a good man. Fixed my dad's chainsaw every spring without charging labor." I smiled despite myself. That sounded like Grandpa, always helping, never counting the cost. "I heard your uncle's claiming the farm," she continued, folding her newspaper with precise movements. "Word travels fast around here. Faster than the truth sometimes," I said, my hand instinctively touching the pocket where the will rested. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you." Her eyebrow raised slightly, professional interest peaked. "Let me guess, you need a lawyer." 20 minutes later, we were walking into her modest office above the barbershop on Main Street. The space was small but tidy, with degrees from Northwestern hanging proudly on the wall next to a framed photo of her family, standing in a cornfield, all matching flannel shirts and genuine smiles. I pulled out the will and letter, laying them carefully on her desk. My hands were sweating, leaving slight marks on the plastic covering. This was it. Either she'd believe me, or I'd look like I was trying to forge my way into an inheritance. Sarah studied the documents with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years learning to spot legal minutiae. She read the will twice, then Grandpa's letter, then examined the notary's seal with a magnifying glass she pulled from her desk drawer. "This looks legitimate, Thomas," she finally said, setting the documents down. "The notary's stamp belongs to Elaine Burkett. She retired last year, but was the real deal. Very respected." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "But Ray's going to play dirty," she continued, leaning back in her chair. "He's already telling people you were barely around, that your grandfather complained about you. He's painting himself as a dutiful son wrongfully overlooked. The accusations stung more than they should have. I'd spent 12 years caring for Grandpa, but there were always those moments of doubt. Had I done enough? Should I have moved in completely instead of keeping my own place? "I was there," I said quietly, "every day." Sarah nodded. "I believe you. But what matters is what we can prove in court. We need to file a petition to validate this will immediately before Ray can establish too much control over the estate." She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes, her handwriting quick and decisive. "And we should find Elaine Burkett. Her testimony about the notarization would be crucial." I hesitated. "There's more to this than just a farm, Sarah." Her pen paused mid-word. "I'm listening." I told her about the coordinates, about what Gus had said regarding the neodymium deposits. Her eyes widened slightly, but her professional composure barely flickered. "That explains a lot," she said when I finished. "Especially Ray's sudden interest in land he barely visited for years." She tapped her pen against the desk, thinking, this makes our timeline even tighter. If there are valuable minerals on that property, Ray will push for rapid probate. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in the county courthouse, tugging uncomfortably at the collar of my only dress shirt. Sarah sat beside me, calm and collected in a simple navy suit, her case materials organized in a leather portfolio that looked both professional and well-used. On the other side of the aisle, Ray and his son sat with their lawyer, Gerald Hoffman, the only attorney in a 3-county radius who wore Italian shoes and drove a Mercedes. Ray had clearly spared no expense. The hearing was just preliminary, to determine if my will should be considered valid enough to halt Ray's claim under intestate succession. But it felt like the Super Bowl, World Series, and Judgment Day all rolled into one. Judge Martha Winslow, who'd been presiding in Cedar Hollow since I was in diapers, peered at us over reading glasses that perpetually sat at the tip of her nose. She was known for being fair, but didn't tolerate theatrics in her courtroom. Hoffman went first, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. He painted Ray as the grieving son, me as the opportunistic grandson who'd magically produce a convenient will. Your Honor, the timing is suspicious at best, he said, gesturing dramatically. Mr. Kelly suddenly finds this document just as potential mineral rights have become valuable, and in his own vehicle with no witnesses. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. Sarah placed a steadying hand on my arm. Furthermore, Hoffman continued, Raymond Kelly was his father's only living child. It defies reason that John Kelly would completely disinherit his son in favor of a grandson who, by multiple accounts, John himself referred to as lazy and uncommitted. The word hit like a physical blow. Lazy? Me? The guy who'd worked full-time while spending every free hour caring for Grandpa? Who'd missed his high school girlfriend's prom because Grandpa had pneumonia? Ray couldn't even look at me. When Sarah stood to speak, the difference between her and Hoffman was stark. No theatrics, just facts delivered with quiet conviction. Your Honor, Thomas Kelly cared for his grandfather for 12 years following his heart disease diagnosis. He has pay stubs showing reduced hours at his mechanic job to accommodate caregiving. He has receipts for medications he purchased, doctor appointments he drove his grandfather to. She placed a folder of documents on the judge's bench. As for the will itself, we've located Elaine Burkett, the notary whose seal appears on the document. She's willing to testify that she indeed notarized this will for John Kelly 2 years ago, and that he was of sound mind and under no duress. A murmur ran through the small crowd gathered in the courtroom. Ray shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have evidence that Raymond Kelly attempted to pressure his father into changing his will approximately 2 years ago. Judge Winslow sat up straighter at this. What evidence, counselor? Sarah pulled out an affidavit. Elaine Burkett states that after notarizing the will leaving everything to Thomas, Ray Kelly approached her about creating a new will. She refused as it appeared improper. When she mentioned this to John Kelly, he confirmed he had no intention of changing his will. Ray's face had gone the color of old cement. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. The hearing continued for another hour, with both sides presenting arguments. By the end, I was mentally exhausted, replaying Grandpa's every word to me, wondering if he really had thought I was lazy. Had I disappointed him without knowing? Judge Winslow adjusted her glasses. I'll need time to review these materials. The will appears legitimate on its face, but given the contested nature and the... She paused, looking between Ray and me. Family complications. I'm setting a full hearing 1 week from today. Outside the courthouse, Cedar Hollow's rumor mill was already churning at full capacity. Some neighbors patted my shoulder supportively. Others gave me side-eye, clearly having heard Ray's version of events. The division felt strange in a town where I'd lived my entire life. Don't let it get to you, Sarah advised as we walked to her car. People always pick sides in these situations. Truth has a way of winning out. I wasn't so sure. Truth needed evidence, and evidence cost money. Something Ray had and I didn't. I can't afford a drawn-out legal battle. I admitted as we reached her car. Hoffman probably bills more per hour than I make in a day. Sarah smiled, a determined glint in her eye. That's why I'm not charging my usual rate. Cedar Hollow needs more people like your grandfather. People who keep their word and help their neighbors without counting the cost. Besides, I want to put Gerald Hoffman in his place since law school. Her loyalty meant more than I could express, but I still felt uncomfortable. At least let me cover the filing fees and research costs. The next few days passed in a blur of depositions and paperwork. Sarah needed $100 for a trip to the state archives to find some property records that might help our case. I handed it over without hesitation. Most of what remained in my checking account, but worth every penny if it helped secure Grandpa's wishes. Meanwhile, Ray wasn't sitting idle. Rumors spread through town about my money grab and taking advantage of an old man. It was hard walking into the grocery store or gas station, feeling eyes on me, wondering who believed what. The most unexpected development came in the form of a letter delivered to my house 3 days before our court date. It was from Midwest Technology Resources, acknowledging the ongoing legal dispute, but expressing their interest in purchasing the property, regardless of who ultimately retains ownership. They offered $200,000 to whoever was determined to be the legal owner, and included separate letters addressed to both me and Ray. $200,000. More money than I'd ever seen at once. Enough to pay off my modest debts, fix up my house, maybe even start my own garage instead of working for someone else. I stared at the letter for hours, turning it over in my hands. The company was clearly hedging their bets, approaching both potential owners. It was clever and tempting, so tempting. I called Sarah that evening and read her the letter. "It's a lowball offer," she said immediately. "If there's neodymium on that land in the quantities Gus suspected, it's worth millions, not thousands." "But it's guaranteed money," I argued. "No legal fees, no waiting, no risk." "It's your decision," Sarah replied. "But ask yourself what your grandfather would have wanted. He didn't hide that will in the Dodge just so you could sell his land for quick cash to the first company that came calling." Her words stuck with me all night. Grandpa had always played the long game. He bought that land when others thought he was crazy, held on to it through droughts and floods when others sold out. He built something meant to last. By morning, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring Grandpa's vision, his trust in me, his truth. As I told Sarah when I called her, fighting for the truth is like overhauling an engine. Messy work, but worth it in the end. The day before our court date, Sarah called with news that set my world spinning again. The notary, Elaine Burkett, had agreed to testify in person rather than just by affidavit. And she had bombshell information. "She says Ray approached your grandfather 2 years ago," Sarah explained, her voice tense with suppressed excitement. "Tried to get him to change the will by claiming you were planning to sell the farm. Your grandfather not only refused but told Elaine he was worried Ray might try something after he was gone. That's why he had her notarize 2 original copies of the will." "2 copies?" I repeated, confused. "Yes, one he kept in his desk, probably the one Ray burned. But he gave the second one to someone for safekeeping. Elaine doesn't know who, but she witnessed him sign both originals." My mind raced. The copy I found wasn't just a photocopy. It was a second original, legally indistinguishable from the first. Grandpa had planned for Ray's betrayal with a thoroughness that left me speechless. "We've got him, Tommy," Sarah said, using my nickname for the first time. "We've got him." The next morning, I sat on my porch watching the sunrise, Grandpa's letter in my hand. Court was in 4 hours. Elaine Burkett's testimony could change everything. But what stuck with me most was what Sarah had said about Grandpa's land. He hadn't just left me property. He'd left me a legacy, a responsibility, something he trusted only me to handle right. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket right next to the will. Whatever happened in court today, I'd face it with the same quiet determination Grandpa had shown his whole life. Judge Winslow would make her ruling, and I'd be ready. Win or lose, I was standing up for Grandpa's truth. I couldn't do anything less. The Cedar Hollow courthouse was packed tighter than a county fair pie contest. Every wooden bench creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk who'd somehow found urgent business at the courthouse that morning. I sat rigid beside Sarah, my palms leaving sweat prints on my best jeans, watching Judge Winslow's face for any hint of which way she was leaning. For a small-town probate hearing, this had turned into the biggest show Cedar Hollow had seen since the high school production of Oklahoma went viral when the windmill prop collapsed mid-performance. Elaine Burkett had testified yesterday, her silver hair bobbing emphatically as she confirmed notarizing two identical originals of Grandpa's will. She described in detail how Ray had approached her about changing the will, and how Grandpa had responded when she told him. The courtroom had gone so quiet you could have heard a mouse sneeze. Now, Judge Winslow shuffled her papers one final time, adjusted those ever-present reading glasses, and cleared her throat. The room collectively held its breath. Having reviewed all evidence presented in the matter of the estate of John Kelly, I find the will presented by Thomas Kelly to be valid and legally binding. The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning registered. I'd won. The farm was mine. Furthermore, the judge continued, given the testimony regarding Raymond Kelly's actions, I'm ordering him to pay court costs and reasonable attorney's fees. Ray's face flushed crimson. His sons, seated behind him, looked like they'd bitten into lemons. Their lawyer was already scribbling notes, probably plotting an appeal, but Sarah had told me such appeals rarely succeeded once the original will was authenticated. I should have felt elation, triumph, vindication. Something big and dramatic. Instead, there was just a quiet certainty settling over me. This was right. This was what Grandpa wanted. Outside the courthouse, beneath the oak trees that had witnessed a century of Cedar Hollow justice, folks gathered in small clusters. Some offered congratulations, hands outstretched and smiles genuine. Others kept their distance, loyalty to Ray or discomfort with the family, dispute keeping them at arm's length. Sarah stood beside me, her professional demeanor finally relaxing into a smile that reached her eyes. Congratulations, landowner. Your grandfather would be proud. I nodded, still processing. I can't believe it's over. Oh, it's not over, she said, glancing at her watch. It's just beginning. Remember those coordinates. The next morning found me standing at the exact spot Grandpa's coordinates had indicated, watching men in khaki uniforms from the State Geological Survey office take core samples from my land. The location was nothing special to look at, just a rocky patch of ground near a small grove of trees where the soil was too poor for good crops. Gus stood beside me, hands in his pockets, watching proceedings with poorly concealed excitement. Your grandpa always said this corner of his land was saving for a rainy day. Thought he meant it was good drainage for floods. 3 weeks later, the official geological report confirmed what we'd suspected. Neodymium. Significant deposits, some of the richest found in the continental United States. The report used terms like economically viable and substantial reserves, but what it really meant was that the 20 acres I'd inherit were suddenly worth more than all the farmland in Cedar Hollow combined. Midwest Technology Resources was just the first company to come calling. Their original $200,000 offer seemed almost comical now. Their new offer started at $5 million for mineral rights alone, leaving me the land itself. By the time 3 other companies entered the bidding war, the number had doubled. $10 million for the rights to extract something I hadn't even known existed beneath my feet a month ago. The final contract with Advanced Materials Corporation included the $10 million upfront, plus royalties on extraction that could potentially double that amount over the next decade. I signed the papers in Sarah's office, my hand trembling slightly as I added my name beneath all those zeros. Her father had insisted on joining us, bringing a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for his 30th anniversary in the hardware business. To John Kelly, he toasted, raising his paper cup of bubbly. The man who could see value where others just saw dirt. Becoming suddenly wealthy in a small town is like showing up to church in a spacesuit. Everyone notices. Everyone has an opinion. And most folks don't know quite how to act around you anymore. The first few weeks were a blur of financial advisors, bank meetings, and neighbors suddenly remembering they'd always considered me practically family. Ray avoided me entirely, which was probably for the best. His sons were less tactful, Mitch making loud comments at the Horseshoe Bar about lucky fools who didn't earn a cent of their fortune. Dale, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable about the whole situation. The thing about money is that it amplifies who you already are. If you're a jerk, money makes you a bigger jerk. If you're generous, it gives you more to share. If you're lost, well, you just get lost with better luggage. I kept thinking about what Grandpa would do. He'd fought in a war, built a farm from nothing, raised a family, and helped neighbors without a second thought. He'd lived by a code where your word was your bond, and you fixed what was broken instead of throwing it away. 6 months after signing the mineral rights deal, I was still living in my modest house, still drove the old Dodge, though with some carefully restored parts, and still wore the same style of clothes I always had. The only visible difference was a brand-new auto repair shop being built on the edge of town, with a sign reading John Kelly Memorial Automotive Training Center. $2 million of my windfall went into Cedar Hollow, repairing the leaky elementary school roof, establishing a scholarship fund for local kids, and making a sizable donation to the Veterans Center where Grandpa had volunteered. Not because I wanted recognition, but because it felt right. The training center was my pride and joy, though, a place where local kids could learn honest trades, just like Grandpa had taught me, a place that fixed things, built things, made things work again. I'd hired 3 experienced mechanics as instructors and planned to teach some classes myself. Tommy's trying to buy his way into heaven. I overheard Mrs. Parsons say at the grocery store, not realizing I was one aisle over. Or maybe he's just not a selfish jackass, her daughter replied, making me smile as I pretended to be deeply interested in canned corn. The afternoon I installed the sign at the training center was unusually warm for October in Iowa. I stood back, surveying the blue and white lettering that bore Grandpa's name. The building behind it was sturdy, practical, built to last, just like him. As I adjusted the sign's angle, the Dodge's familiar rumble announced Sarah's arrival. She'd taken to driving it occasionally when we went to dinner, claiming she needed practice with manual transmission. I suspected she just liked the connection to Grandpa's story, to the beginning of our unlikely friendship. "Looks perfect," she said, stepping out with 2 coffee cups in hand. "Though I'm pretty sure you've adjusted it 17 times now." I accepted the coffee with a smile. Gotta get it right. Grandpa always said, "Do it right even when no one's watching." We finished in unison. She laughed, bumping my shoulder with hers. "You know, for a millionaire, you parked that truck like a teenager who just got his license." I glanced at the Dodge, which was indeed sitting at a slight angle to the curb. Hey, I never claimed to be good at parking, just at fixing engines and apparently finding rare earth minerals. We sat on the tailgate, watching the October sun cast long shadows across the training center's new parking lot. In just a few months, it would be filled with students learning the kinds of practical skills that had kept Cedar Hollow running for generations. "Have you been out to the dig site lately?" Sarah asked. I nodded. The extraction operation was impressively efficient, and thanks to my insistence and willingness to take slightly lower profits, environmentally responsible. The engineers had shown me maps of the deposits, explaining how they planned to extract the neodymium with minimal disturbance to the surrounding land. It's strange seeing all that activity out there. I admitted that corner of Grandpa's property was always so quiet, just scrubby trees and rocky soil. He knew, Sarah said thoughtfully, maybe not exactly what was there, but he knew it was valuable. That's why he made sure you'd get it. The thought had occurred to me, too. Grandpa was a geologist, but he'd been sensitive to the land in a way most people aren't anymore. He could predict weather changes from how the air felt, knew where to dig a well by testing the soil with his hands. It wouldn't surprise me if he'd somehow sensed the value beneath that rocky corner of his farm. "I've been thinking about Grandpa a lot lately," I said. "All his stories, his advice. I'm worried I'll forget some of it." Sarah sipped her coffee, considering, "You should write them down." And that's how the journal began. Not as some grand memoir or publishing venture, just a simple leather-bound book where I recorded Grandpa's wisdom, his war stories, his jokes, his advice on everything from fixing carburetors to judging character. I wrote about how he'd come back from the war and courted my grandmother by fixing her father's tractor, how he'd weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s by growing his own food and helping neighbors do the same, how he taught me to fish using a hand whittle rod when I was too small to handle the regular ones. The journal became a ritual, a few pages every evening, sitting in the Dodge with the radio playing classic country music Grandpa had loved. Sometimes I'd drive out to that hill overlooking the farm, his farm, my farm now, and right as the sun set over the fields. One evening, nearly a year after court decision, I took the journal and drove up to that hillside. The autumn colors were at their peak, the harvested fields stretching out like a patchwork quilt. In the distance, I could see the lights of the extraction operation, running 24/7 now that production was in full swing. I opened the journal to a fresh page, my pen hovering over the paper. The past year had transformed everything. My bank account, certainly, but also my sense of purpose. The money had given me freedom, but Grandpa's legacy had given me direction. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Don't forget dinner at 7. Mom's making her famous pot roast and asking if you're too rich now for her cooking." I smiled, typing back, "Never too rich for pot roast. And tell her I'm bringing that apple pie from Henderson's." Sarah and I had grown close over the year, first as attorney and client, then as friends, and lately something more, though we were taking it slow. She still maintained her law practice, refusing my offers to help expand it, insisting on making her own way. I respected that independence. It reminded me of Grandpa. Our relationship was the one thing in my life I hadn't told anyone about yet, not even in the journal. It felt too new, too private, too important to risk jinxing with words. But she became as much a part of my daily life as the Dodge or the training center. I looked down at the journal page and finally began to write. Grandpa used to say that life isn't about what you take, but what you leave behind. I think about that a lot now. The words flowed easier these days. I'd filled nearly half the journal with memories, lessons, reflections, not just for me, but for the kids of the training center, for Cedar Hollow, for anyone who might someday want to know what kind of man John Kelly had been. As I wrote, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice carried on the autumn breeze, not saying anything specific, just that familiar, comforting rumble that had guided me through childhood and beyond, the voice that had taught me how engines worked, how to stand up for what's right, how to recognize the value in things others might overlook. The journal wasn't just preserving his wisdom, it was helping me find my own. Each story I recorded seemed to clarify something about my path forward, about the man I wanted to be. The extraction company had asked last week if I'd consider selling more land. The deposit apparently extended further than initially thought. I declined, explaining that the farmland itself wasn't for sale. Money was nice, but some things were meant to be commodities. The farming operation, now run by 3 local families who leased the land from me at fair rates, was part of Cedar Hollow's lifeblood. Grandpa had understood the delicate balance between progress and preservation. I was trying to honor that understanding. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that no artist could properly capture. I closed the journal and slid it carefully into my jacket pocket, next to Grandpa's letter, which I still carried everywhere. The future stretched out before me like those Iowa fields, full of possibility, requiring care and attention, promising rewards for patient stewardship. I had resources now that Grandpa never had, but the principles guiding their use were entirely his. Back in the Dodge, I sat for a moment with the engine off, just taking in the view. From this hillside, you couldn't see property lines or legal boundaries. It was just land, beautiful and enduring, the same land that had supported generations of Kellys and would support generations more. The extraction operation was temporary. 10 years at most, according to the engineers. Then the land would be restored, the equipment gone, and only the financial benefits would remain. But this view, these fields, this legacy, that was permanent. My phone buzzed again with another text from Sarah. Don't forget your journal this time. The kids at the center want to hear more of your grandpa's war stories. I'd started reading selections to the automotive students during lunch breaks. They'd been surprisingly interested. Teenagers normally more concerned with TikTok and video games, sitting quietly as I read Grandpa's accounts of fixing tanks in France or his techniques for stretching gasoline during rationing. One boy, reminiscent of myself at that age, had asked for specifics on how Grandpa had modified carburetors to improve fuel efficiency during the energy crisis. I'd promised to bring in diagrams next time. Starting the Dodge, I felt the familiar vibration of its engine, an old mechanical heart still beating strong despite the years. The dashboard hula girl nodded in agreement as I turned toward town, toward Sarah and pot roast and whatever came next. Life had a funny way of circling back on itself. Here I was, a wealthy man by any standard, finding my greatest joy in an old truck, a budding relationship with Sarah, and teaching kids the same skills my grandfather had taught me. Maybe that's what Grandpa had intended all along, not just to leave me land or money, but to give me a foundation, a starting point from which to build something meaningful. The town lights began to twinkle in the distance as I drove down from the hillside. Cedar Hollow wasn't much compared to big cities, just a few thousand souls making their way as best they could. But it was home, my home, in a way that no penthouse or mansion could ever be. I patted the journal in my pocket. "Thanks, Grandpa," I said to the empty cab, my voice barely audible over the engine's steady rumble. The road stretched out before me, bathed in the Dodge's headlights. Whatever lay ahead, challenges, opportunities, surprises, I'd face it with the quiet determination Grandpa had shown his whole life, and I wouldn't be facing it alone. As Cedar Hollow's welcome sign came into view, I thought about that moment in the barn a year ago, watching Ray burn what he thought was my future. How desperate and betrayed I'd felt. How certain that everything was lost. I couldn't have imagined then where the road would lead. To hidden wills and rare earth minerals, to courtroom victories and community investments, to journal writings and quiet evenings with Sarah. Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes it leads us through fire and uncertainty before delivering us somewhere better than we could have planned. I turned onto Main Street, heading toward the warmth of friendship and pot roast, the old Dodge carrying me forward just as it always had. Steady, reliable, a bridge between past and future.